My name is Uwe Brandis. I'm the Executive Director of the new Urban and Regional Planning Program here at Georgetown. And if some of you joined us last week, you'll know we've organized this public speaking series to really kind of kick off the program's inaugural first year. We started last week with Steve Fuller, professor at George Mason University, and we talked about the regional economy, the regional presence that Washington, D.C. Has internationally, and looked at some of the macroeconomic issues for the region. It is great, with great excitement and pleasure, that today we have Roger Lewis with us. If there is a Renaissance man in Washington, it is Roger Lewis. Roger is a practicing architect. Roger is an emeritus professor at the University of Maryland. Roger is a journalist, has a regular column within the at the Washington Post called Shaping the City. Roger is a radio personality now, and appears, or I guess we hear him regularly on the Kojo Namdi show. For me, Roger's been an incredible resource because he thinks about, observes, and provides extraordinary insight into how the process of urban planning and urban development actually happens. And it's a great honor for us to have you here today, Roger, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Uwe, for inviting me. Thank you for coming out here on this soggy afternoon. One thing that I should disclose, Uwe, he mentioned my life as a journalist. I've been writing Shaping the City in the Washington Post since 1984, but it's perhaps more remembered and recognized for the cartoons, the illustrations that I've been drawing accompanying the column ever since. And you're going to have to deal with that because that's what you're going to see this afternoon. I'm going to go through a series of images that are mostly my cartoons drawn over these last 29 years. It's hard to believe I've been writing this column for 29 years. I want you to read. I'm not going to read these cartoons. I mean, there's text with each one of them. I want you to read them as you hear me make comments about what these cartoons signify and how they relate to what you're interested in. You'll notice here that it says, and Folly, plans, aspirations, and folly. One of the things you're going to see, all these cartoons are meant to be somewhat funny, witty, and satirical. Sometimes they are not quite as funny as I intended them, but they're all didactic. They all are delivering a message, which I think you'll get. So let's just launch into this. I'm going to be roaming over a very broad landscape of issues and challenges and opportunities of concern to, I think, everybody in this room. I will leave some time, I hope, to have some Q&A afterwards. But if you see something, this is a small enough group. This is still seminar size. If you see something along the way and you feel that you want to ask a question or it isn't clear, please just holler out or raise your hand. By the way, I really appreciate this huge screen. I've given many, many talks with drawings like this where the screen is of a size where the front half is sitting there laughing hysterically and the back half of the room can't read, can't see what's on the screen. And I've usually had to go back and herd the people at the rear up to the front. We don't have that problem. I'm going to start with just a few words about the city we live in, Washington, D.C. This is a unique city, of course, as you all know. It was planned. It's not only the first planned capital of the United States, the only planned capital of the United States, it's one of the relatively few planned capitals. And even though it was the late 1790s, we consider it a somewhat modern plan. What I always love to show this slide, because this is about a planner, Pierre L'Enfant, who some of you may know, got fired. And you should just keep that in back of your mind, that no matter how good your plan might be, and the Washington plan is a fabulous plan, we still live with it today and follow it today, there were problems. The other reason I'm showing you this is is one of the things about the plan of Washington is that it's extremely orderly. What L'Enfant did, and his clients agreed, was to impose on a landscape, which was essentially farmland, a very rational plan. I think some of you probably know it was inspired to some extent by French planning. He was familiar with the layout of Versailles Gardens, and I won't bore you with all that. But you don't need to know anything about the history of urban design to know when you look at this that there's something different about this than, for example, how suburban Maryland and Virginia look. We'll come back to that. And part of the wonder and the beauty and the elegance of the L'Enfant plan of Washington, and I think this slide shows it, is it really, although a two-dimensional map, a two-dimensional diagram of a pattern of streets and blocks and public spaces, it in fact had three-dimensional implications, and you know those by looking, or you understand that, I think, by looking at this drawing, where I've essentially treated all the built fabric as if it were cheese that's been carved up, that's framing, shaping, configuring the public space that you know so well of Washington. And we continue to respect that. Much of the subsequent planning that's gone on, this was about, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, in the National Capital Planning Commission. Anybody here from NCPC? No. You'll hear from somebody from NCPC. Mr. Costa will be here. They did some speculative planning about what could happen along South Capitol Street. You can see the same ideas here, which is this very, very clear, urbanistically well-defined spaces where the public realm of streets, not the buildings, but the streets, we call this a figure ground. Have any of you heard that term? This is a figure ground plan where black is building or built form, and what's left is the public space. And the notion then and the notion now, and we still, as urban designers and architects, are very anxious to create more, not less, public civic spaces that are usable. And these really are the things that we sort of lost sight of, as you'll see in a moment, when we started making making plans for expansion of the city out into the landscape. And this slide, I think, is delivering a very simple message. Notwithstanding the formality, if you will, of the L'Enfant plan, that was a plan for a city. There have always been in America, there's always been a segment of the population not so sure they wanted cities or wanted to live in cities. And the result of that was, during the 20th century, we began to make plans that looked a lot different. And here you see some planners looking at a plan on a drawing board. This might have been sometime after World War II. This could have been the 50s or 60s or even the 70s. And they're arguing over the colors to make, because planning, now look at this plan. This looks very different than the L'Enfant plan. This is a plan of the village of Churchill in Germantown, Maryland. I don't know if any of you live anywhere near there or know where Germantown, Maryland. So it's not that far away. It's up Rockville Pike. I know this plan very well because I made it. If you look up there, you'll see Roger Lewis and Associates on the upper left. This was a plan I think we did about 1970, 71, 72, when we had not we'd kind of forgotten. We'd forgotten what L'Enfant had done. We had forgotten how to make good urban design. This is, again, a magic marker plan, I call this. You can see very clearly a bunch of land uses and some densities identified there. But there's certainly no sense of order. I mean, I think you'd have a hard time. You could look at this. I bet a lot of you could go away after this talk and maybe even sketch out diagrammatically what the L'Enfant plan looks like. Because you remember, it was a grid, some diagonals. You won't remember this. But this is what we thought was the way to plan back then. With following the topography religiously, letting things loop around, and it was all about a kind of romantic notion of working with the landscape and not imposing grids and orderly systems of movement. And that, of course, was manifested, a plan like that was manifested in public policy through zoning. I'm going to talk a lot about zoning in the next few minutes. Here is what zoning was all about. Zoning came about with the notion of protecting property values and making sure that incompatible uses didn't get built next to each other. So what zoning primarily has done, and I will say several times today, zoning has never been an effective tool for creating good urban design. It's not an urban design tool, never has been, and in many forms will never be. But what do you see here is a bunch of separated uses, low density, residential, commercial. More importantly, in the axonometric drawing, you see that thing up at the top, conceptual walls of enclosure and separation. What zoning has primarily done in the United States is what you see in this drawing. It's created sprawl, it's created growth characterized by isolated uses, not interconnected networks of streets. It's certainly a long way from the L'Enfant plan. And we here in Washington, well, we're lucky. We had all this land floating around D.C. There's D.C. Do you see the L'Enfant center of this? And really, not just in the past, but I think in the future, one of the great challenges, as implied by this balloon here, is getting these people to think regionally. Because we still, as a matter of practice, as a matter of law, we still are doing a lot of our planning and development in a fragmented manner, incrementally. So what Prince George's County is doing is independent of what Prince William, Loudoun, Frederick, or Montgomery County are doing, and that is still one of the challenges. That's something you guys are going to face. But with all of that real estate sitting out there after the end of the 19th century, yeah, you read the slides. That land was also inexpensive, and it was just a matter of time before pressures would arise that caused people, particularly the people who weren't so sure about cities, that guy in that slide who was thinking that maybe cities are evil things, before there were pressures to start developing outside of the city. And a lot of what has happened, and this relates back to last week's discussion by Steve Fuller, there were tremendous pressures, of course, to go and use that land, to occupy and develop that land. And, oh, this seems out of focus. Is this in focus? I'm sorry that's not in focus. The best part of it is the guy in the bulldozer, and he's being told that there was a tree he missed. One of the things that, as I said, happened over and over and over again is each of these jurisdictions in this region went their own way in adopting policy, making zoning regulations, allowing development to occur. So you had all kinds of, you had all kinds of, let me go back, sprawl-inducing initiatives taken by the private developers. And that's what produced sprawl. It was abetted, of course, it was aided by other things that we ought to talk a little bit about. Very inexpensive energy, cheap gasoline, automobile, building of the interstate highway systems. You've probably read some of this. These were major factors, influences, in causing sprawl to occur. Again, I apologize. I don't know why these are out of focus. I guess there's no focusing button on here. What you see here, of course, is the Rockville Pike in 1789 and in 1989, and they're commenting in both the sides of this diptych the same thing. When are we going to get to Rockville? Well, we might get there by nightfall, because at times it takes just as long to get there in a car as it did in a horse and buggy. In other words, part of the symptom of sprawl, as some of you have probably experienced, if not all of you, is traffic congestion. Here's Rockville Pike. I'm sorry these are not clear. Not only that, you may have noticed, if any of you travel around, that all of Sprawlburbia looks the same. It's highly homogeneous. It's and that's the point of this slide. I mean, what we have done is created something, or created an environment, a physical environment, resulting from the forces I've summarized, that tends to start looking all the same. So I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, which, by the way, is a city with no zoning, but the suburbs of Houston don't look much different than the suburbs of Virginia or Maryland. Another force, we better talk about this for a few minutes, is what I would call socioeconomic pressures. Here you see, this one I think you can read. This is simply emblematic of the fact that people in America tend to want to live around and with people who are like themselves. And people who are not like themselves, or who they might find, for whatever reason, undesirable to associate with, we've tended to allow this kind of socioeconomic segregation to occur, or it has, when I say we've allowed it to occur, it has occurred naturally because it's in human nature to behave that way, and so we also get the phenomenon of people, for example, escaping the city, because after, certainly before World War II, but particularly after World War II, as cities began to change demographically, a lot of people said, well, I don't want to live with these people who are now moving to my city. I'm getting the hell out. I'm moving to suburban Maryland or Virginia. So you need to keep that in mind. Here's a reality slide. This is an image I drew for the Growth Management Handbook, which I co-authored back in, 1989, long time ago. One of the things that, of course, is the reality is that these regions interact, and parts of regions interact. And this is simply a diagram showing that in a region, that could be a county or two counties in which there's some municipalities. In fact, they do interact. They are not autonomous and independent, even though they tend to be governed that way, and the people living in there tend to think that way. We do not generally think regionally in this region. In that same book, I talked about design linkages, that there's a project sitting in the middle, but you notice there are a whole bunch of grid lines crossing through there. The intent of this it may be a little too subtle, was to show that these things are all interacting beyond the boundaries of your site, or for that matter, of your neighborhood, your village or town, your city. That's very important. And the other thing to keep in mind that has started to become more clearly articulated, I think Steve referred to this, is the demographics have shifted. When I started practicing, when I was a student in the 60s, and when I was practicing and doing a lot of housing, I've built designed thousands of housing units in my day. It used to be that most houses were imagined to be serving the nuclear family: mom, dad, 2.3 kids, and maybe a couple of dogs. That has changed. The nuclear family is now a minority. It's the number of households in the United States that match that template is well below 50%. And this is, I think, going to be increasingly the case in the United States, something you all will be dealing with, is we have a much more complex demographic structure than we used to have, made up of a lot of different kinds of households. Another thing that is important to think about in this region, if you look at this drawing on the left, how many of you have heard of the Wedges and Carters plan? The Wedges and Carters plan, you see it on the left. This was the vision after World War II. This was the vision, and there was a master plan. There was a regional plan made for Metro Washington that looked like that. It was all predicated on the assumption, again, that the l'enfant part of this metropolitan area, the center, D.C., would be where most everybody wanted to go, wanted to work, and they'd have these various paths of travel, the radii that you see on the left. And we'll throw a beltway in. You see the beltway there? That was the concept. I mean, that was it. I think you all probably know, I said 2160s, but it's already here. If you look at the right, the reality is that we have, in fact, a polycentric metropolitan area. And it's increasingly, the polycentricity is increasing tremendously. This has huge implications, again, touched on by Steve last week, because you all know money, air, pollution, traffic doesn't these jurisdictional boundaries mean nothing. They're transparent. So the reality is not the image on the left, the diagram on the left, but the one on the right. Unfortunately, I'll go on beyond this. Oh, can you read that? No. This is a guy, let me go one more. Unfortunately, what we did, of course, because we planned the transit system 50 years ago, we did build a transit system predicated on that wedges and corridors concept. So our metro system, our subway system, is in fact a manifestation of that thinking. It's primarily based on the notion that people are going to live out along these radial corridors and they were going to come into the middle of the city. And a lot do, but a lot more do not, and an increasing number do not. The movement patterns are now lattice-like. And anyone who's been to Paris, any of you been to Paris, London, Moscow, the subway network is a lattice. It's not built like this. It's a lattice in which you can, and I was just in Paris. There are really almost no 2 points in that city that you can't get between in 30 minutes. I don't know if you can read this, but this is cute. This guy is saying, as I understand, the Greater Washington Board of Trade is proposing a regional transportation authority. And in the next 4 panels, he's talking about all the benefits of that. And he gets into the last panel and he says, naturally, I'm against it. Why is that? Why have I put this in? I've hinted at it already. One of the problems is political. One of the obstacles to doing what I'm implicitly and explicitly proposing, which is to act regionally, to behave regionally, to recognize that these jurisdictional political boundaries that go back hundreds of years, really, have still a lingering, or create a lingering impediment, which is the tremendously strong sense of political autonomy that the people who live in these jurisdictions cling to, and you're going to have to deal with that. I mean, it is still with us. The metro system. Are you all aware that the metro system, they were unable to create a truly autonomous regional authority. The Metro Pact is in fact a joint venture of D.C., Maryland and all of its jurisdictions, and Virginia and all its jurisdictions. It's herding cats. I mean, it's trying to get our subway system in order has been very, very difficult because WMATA, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, they can't sell bonds. They're completely dependent on the political officials of all of these different jurisdictions. And you can imagine getting them all in a room like this and trying to agree on something is very, very difficult. Equally difficult are drivers, are people who drive cars, because we are a culture in which the automobile continues to be very dominant, an extremely important part of our lives, and we're loosening up a little bit. But this is another part of the challenge, is there are a lot of people who just are not going to give up their automobiles. I can't tell you how many people I know, friends of ours, who can't stand bicyclists. They actually think the road is theirs, it belongs to them. Why are these bicycles? I bicycle all the time. I live in D.C. If the weather had been good, I'd have biked here today. But the good news is more and more people are biking. And you all know that bike share has been a great success in Washington. It's now being adopted and installed in Arlington County and Montgomery County. And it's coming. I mean, there will be more and more biking. It's not, incidentally, from a traffic engineering point of view, you only need to cut daily vehicle trips about 10 or 15% to drastically reduce congestion. You don't have to get half the people off the road. If you can just cut routine vehicle trips, daily trips by people driving cars, if you can just knock it down 15%, it makes a huge difference in the congestion. I had to show this bill, we're serious in D.C. Any of you live in D.C.? Some of you probably live in D.C. You've seen this building next to Union Station. I had to throw that picture in. I think it's great that this city is committing resources to creating opportunities for people to more safely and more cost-effectively bicycle. Here again, I mean, this is another four-panel cartoon I did many years ago that maybe the guy in the upper right corner is the most typical. But it's a problem. There are people who my wife and I have a number of friends who will not ride metro. Some of them, for some it's fearful, some are afraid it's going to break down. I mean, it's irrational. Transit-oriented development, I'm sorry, I don't know why these are coming out blurred. This is something that we've been talking about this for about 15 years. The notion is, if you spend billions of dollars building a transit system with stations all over the place, wouldn't it be a good idea to have more rather than fewer people living near these transit nodes so they can use the transit and get rid of one of their cars and maybe not even use the car? This is one of those duh ideas. You'd think everybody would go for this. Nope. There's still in Washington and other places many people who see increasing density, whether there's a transit stop or not, is a threat to their neighborhood. It's a serious problem. Arlington, Virginia is the poster child, really, for transit-oriented development. Any of you live in Arlington? That's an extraordinary story, and I think I have time to give you a little of it. In 1968, that whole corridor from Roslyn, which is right across from Georgetown, out to Ballston, was really seedy. I mean, it was low density, probably not even 0.3 FAR, floor area ratio. Do you all know what FAR is, floor area ratio? They will. Just the ratio of the total floor area to the area of a piece of land it sits on. And the metro was being extended, and the Orange Line, they wanted to run the Orange Line down the middle of the highway right-of-way, above ground, or maybe below ground. But Arlington, at that time, there were people in Arlington that said, no, we think you ought to put it underground and run it under Wilson Boulevard, because we think that if you do that, and also we think you ought to have not 2 stations, but 5 stations, because we think eventually, if you do that, a whole lot of development will occur on the surface above that, and eventually we'll get our money back. And we're talking big money, because what WMATA said to Arlington is, oh, well, you have to pay for that. So amazingly, this is back in the 1960s, the Arlington Board of Supervisors, they voted to spend millions of dollars on moving the line out of the right-of-way, which was free, moving it, tunneling underneath that corridor, building 5 stations. And if any of you have ridden out there, you know the stations are reasonably close together, the way they are in other cities. And of course, there was also skepticism because the corridor is lined by low-density subdivisions, single-family subdivisions. Well, they were also opposed to this because they thought that building up the corridor with high-density development was going to completely destroy their quality of life, lower property values. That was then. Well, what's happened? They built the line. Amazingly, the investment by the Arlington citizens was approved. That corridor is now highly developed. I can't say all the architecture is what it should be, but that's another story. I'll give you a lecture on that later. It has more than paid for more than paid for many times over the real estate tax revenues generated by the development that's occurred over the last 40 years, or 35 years, I guess is a more realistic number. In that corridor has more than paid back the cost of the infrastructure. Plus all these single-family houses, can you see them sort of They love it. They can walk to Starbucks. They can walk to their 40 or 50 or 60 restaurants. Their house values have quintupled. I mean, those houses now, which I think when the subway line was put in, you could have bought for $35,000 or $40,000. They're now 10, 15 times. In other words, the fears, the phobias, the anxieties were proved to be incorrect. And Arlington, I attended an event out there when they honored those original supervisors way back when, who had the foresight to do this. That's transit-oriented development. Then we have places like Tyson's Corner. If you look at this existing and proposed, again, you can sort of see my l'enfant plan creeping in here. You see commercial strip road, parking lots abounding. Any of you been to Tyson's Corner? This should remind you of what Tyson's Corner looks like, which is 1,700 acres. Tyson's Corner is as large as most American city downtowns and then some. That's 1,700 acres. But they realized, oops, I'm sorry, let me go back. In order to do what you see in this drawing, to redevelop these areas, increase density, to enable transit-oriented development, we have to go back and look at zoning. Because in most jurisdictions in the United States, and this is true in Maryland and Virginia and DC, much of the zoning doesn't allow some of the kinds of development that we now believe to be desirable, particularly higher density, mixed-use development. And in fact, what's happened is the zoning ordinances over the years have gotten so layered with additional detail and regulations and unnecessary stipulations and constraints, as this slide is trying to suggest, that we in the planning and architecture world and real estate development world, we've been saying for a long time, you got to redo these zoning ordinances because A, they're too complex. You got to hire a zoning lawyer to work for your regular lawyer to figure out what the hell they allow and don't allow. And we are now going through, the good news is, a number of jurisdictions, DC is doing it, Montgomery County is doing it, are revisiting their zoning ordinances. Because what, if you look at this, what we've been getting, and it's particularly true of Washington with its height limits, we tend to be getting an awful lot of buildings that look like the second at the top and the first on the bottom. You notice that the developer's box looks a lot like the zoning envelope. That's because of the economic pressures that exist that tend to make a lot of the buildings look sort of the same geometrically, volumetrically. By the way, we're going to talk about this next Thursday, a week from today, on the Kojo Namdi Show. If your radio at noon next Thursday, we're going to be talking about architecture and zoning and the regulatory influences that shape our city. Anyway, this is a city, Washington in particular, that right now is looking at its zoning, including looking at height limits. Some of you probably know that we have a height limit set by law in 1910 by the Congress, Height of Buildings Act. You can't build a building over 130 feet high in Washington, except along Pennsylvania Avenue where you can go 160 feet. This is, I'm making fun of something here. This was to illustrate a column about the proposed lifting in certain areas of the height restrictions. The idea in Washington was that the building shouldn't be much higher than the street is wide. There was, and that's still a valid idea. No one here wants